She sat in first class, calm, quiet, and respectful. When she politely asked for a glass of water, the flight attendant paused, then refused, loudly, in front of everyone. No one spoke up, no one questioned it. But what no one realized was who this woman really was, because when she made one silent call, everything changed. The flight, the crew, and the airline itself would never be the same again. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. She took her seat quietly in the front row of first class, settling into the smooth leather with her usual grace. Her name was Judge Evelyn Rhodes, though few people on the flight would recognize her by face alone. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer and slacks, with her graying hair tied neatly at the back, she carried herself with quiet confidence. In her lap rested a slim black folder filled with handwritten notes. Final revisions for the keynote speech she was scheduled to deliver the next morning. It was a speech about dignity, equal treatment, and the silent power of restraint. As the last of the passengers boarded, Evelyn reached up and pressed the call button. Her throat was dry from the morning rush, and she hadn't had time to grab a bottle of water at the terminal. She waited calmly, her eyes on the front pocket of the seat in front of her. A few moments later, the flight attendant arrived. Her name tag read, Marla. She was in her late 40s, with perfectly styled blonde curls and a stiff smile that never quite touched her eyes. She didn't greet Evelyn. She didn't ask what she needed. Instead, she stood still, staring down at her as if waiting for her to explain herself. Evelyn spoke gently. "Could I please have a bottle of water?" Marla folded her arms. "Water service hasn't started yet." "I understand," Evelyn replied, still calm. "It's just, my throat is a bit dry. If it's not too much trouble." "Ma'am," Marla interrupted, her voice louder now. Heads in first class began to turn. "I said we haven't started yet. You'll need to wait until we've finished boarding and reached cruising altitude." There was no reason to speak that loudly. Evelyn knew it. And so did the man sitting beside her, a quiet traveler in a gray suit who looked down at his book, suddenly very interested in the pages. "I didn't mean to be difficult," Evelyn said softly. Marla didn't respond. She stood there a second longer, then turned and walked off without another word. Evelyn didn't look around, but she could feel the shift in the air. People were watching her now, judging, assuming. That was the part that hurt more than the water being denied. Not one person had offered to help. Not one had spoken up. She wasn't surprised, but that didn't make it easier. She reached into her handbag, pulled out her phone, and sent a quick message to her assistant. "Denied water in first class, no reason given. It felt intentional. Please alert Thomas." She pressed send, placed the phone back in her bag, and returned to her notes. Her expression didn't change, but her heartbeat was no longer steady. Thomas Langston, the CEO of the airline, wasn't just a professional connection. He was a longtime friend, someone who respected her beyond titles and roles. Evelyn hadn't said much. She hadn't caused a scene. She hadn't raised her voice, but she had made a call. And that call was about to change everything. The plane continued boarding as Evelyn sat motionless in her seat, her hands resting gently on the folder in her lap. Her face remained calm, but her mind wasn't still. She replayed the interaction over and over, the tone Marla had used, the way she looked at her, as if she didn't belong in that seat. It wasn't about the water. It was about the way she was dismissed, the way her simple request had been turned into a problem. She had faced these moments before, subtle, sharp, and always in silence. But this time something told her it wouldn't be ignored. Marla moved through the cabin with ease, greeting passengers as they entered. She smiled at a man in a tailored blue suit, nodded warmly at a woman in a silk scarf, and even helped a teenager stow his bag. Not once did she glance back at Evelyn. In the galley, Marla leaned against the counter and let out a short sigh. Another attendant, a younger woman named Julia, was organizing beverage trays beside her. "Everything okay?" Julia asked without looking up. Marla shrugged. Some people just think the world owes them something. That woman in 2B, already demanding water like she's royalty. Julia paused. Did she ask politely? Marla scoffed. It's not about how she asked. It's the attitude. You can tell when someone expects special treatment. Julia didn't respond right away. She knew Marla well. The senior attendant had a reputation for being sharp, especially when it came to certain passengers. I guess, Julia finally said, her voice low. Still, doesn't hurt to be kind. Marla raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She turned her attention back to organizing carts, her movements quick and clipped. Meanwhile, back in first class, Evelyn's phone buzzed once in her bag. She reached down, retrieved it, and saw a reply. Thomas Langston. What happened? Tell me everything. Flight number? Her fingers moved quickly. Flight 747 to Boston. Denied basic courtesy. Not the first time, but this one felt different. Public, loud. I stayed calm. There was a short pause before her phone vibrated again. Thomas. Thank you. Sit tight. I'll handle it. Evelyn locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the tray table. She knew what that meant. Thomas wasn't the kind of man to call and complain. He was the kind to show up, to make things clear. And when he did, the silence wouldn't be on her side. It would be on theirs. She turned her eyes back to her notes, pretending to read, but her thoughts had already moved far beyond the words on the page. The seatbelt sign blinked on. The captain's voice came through the speakers with the usual announcements. And just like that, the wheels were up. But things were far from settled. The plane had been in the air for 20 minutes when Marla finally began drink service in first class. She moved with robotic politeness, offering wine and sparkling water with a smile that had returned to her face. Evelyn watched her approach each passenger with courtesy, greeting them by title, offering refills, exchanging light jokes. When Marla finally reached her row, the tray cart slowed, and the smile wavered just slightly. Marla didn't make eye contact. Would you like something to drink? Evelyn looked at her calmly. Still no water? The tray was full. Bottles of water lined in plain sight. Marla cleared her throat. Of course. I meant to offer earlier. She poured the water, set it down carefully, and moved to the next seat before Evelyn could respond. The damage had already been done, and Marla knew it. But she didn't know how much. Back in the galley, Julia was wiping down surfaces when the in-flight phone rang. Marla answered quickly, assuming it was the captain requesting an update. Her face changed as she listened. She didn't say a word at first, just nodded, eyes narrowing, lips pressing into a thin line. When she hung up, she stood still, processing. Julia looked over. Everything okay? Marla didn't respond right away. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. That was the captain. He wants to see me. Now. Julia blinked. Why? Marla didn't answer. She straightened her jacket and left the galley without another word, her steps quicker than before. In the cockpit, the pilot waited, his expression unreadable. A video call was already active on the secure screen mounted beside the flight panel. On the screen was a man in a dark suit, sitting in an office with the airline's crest on the wall behind him. Thomas Langston. Marla, the pilot said flatly. Please explain what happened with the passenger in 2B. She hesitated. She asked for water before service began. I told her she had to wait. That's standard procedure. Langston's voice came through the speaker, controlled, sharp. Is it also standard procedure to raise your voice at a passenger for asking a basic courtesy? Marla's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to speak so directly. I didn't mean for it to sound that way. Thomas didn't blink. The passenger you dismissed is Judge Evelyn Rhodes, a keynote speaker, a federal judge, and more importantly, someone who had every right to be treated with respect. Marla opened her mouth, then shut it again. We're not going to debate what happened, Thomas continued. We're going to fix it. You're going to apologize, clearly, publicly, and without excuses. The captain remained silent beside her. And when you land, Thomas added, You'll report directly to my office." The screen went black. Marla stood frozen. For the first time in years, she didn't feel in control. And back in seat 2B, Evelyn sipped her water quietly, her eyes steady, her silence deliberate. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't have to. Marla walked back through the aisle, but her steps no longer carried the same confidence. Passengers noticed the change. Her stiff posture, the tightness in her jaw, the way she avoided eye contact. She paused just outside the first-class cabin, adjusted her uniform with trembling fingers, then stepped toward Evelyn's row. Evelyn didn't look up right away. She turned a page in her notes, circled something lightly with a pen, and then lifted her gaze. Their eyes met. There was no anger in Evelyn's face, no gloating. Just that same quiet steadiness that unsettled Marla far more than if she had shouted. "Judge Rhodes," Marla began, her voice softer than it had been since boarding. "I want to apologize for earlier. I misjudged the situation and handled it poorly. I'm sorry if I caused any discomfort." The apology felt rehearsed, shallow, like something she was told to say. Evelyn's voice was low but firm. "You didn't misjudge the situation. You misjudged me." Marla flinched slightly but didn't move. "I asked for water," Evelyn continued, "and you made a decision about who I was based on what you thought I should be." A man across the aisle lowered his tablet, now listening openly. A few others subtly turned their heads. "I've flown this airline for 15 years, Evelyn said, her voice calm. "First class, business class, economy. And I've seen how you treat people when no one's watching." Marla's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to respond, but Evelyn raised a hand slightly, just enough to pause her. "I'm not interested in rehearsed lines," she said. "If you're sorry, fine, but understand this. What you did wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice." The words hung in the air. The quiet in the cabin grew heavier. Evelyn picked up her water and took a slow sip. "You can go now." Marla hesitated, then turned without a word and walked back to the galley, her face burning. In her seat, Evelyn didn't smile. She didn't need to. The apology had come, but the power had already shifted, and it wasn't going back. Back in the galley, Marla leaned against the counter, her breathing uneven. She stared blankly at the wall, replaying the conversation in her head. The words cut deeper than she expected. It was a choice. She had heard complaints before. Some passengers were rude, some demanding, but none had ever made her feel exposed like this, and none had the weight to shift the atmosphere of an entire cabin with a few calm words. Julia stood nearby, silent. She had overheard most of it. The energy in the cabin had changed. Everyone could feel it, even those pretending not to listen. Julia didn't speak, but her eyes said enough. There was no defense left for Marla to lean on. In first class, Evelyn had returned to her notes. But she wasn't reading. Her mind had moved on. The apology, shallow as it was, had been public. That mattered. Passengers who had once ignored her were now watching her with a different kind of attention. Curious, uncertain, maybe even a little guilty. A young man in a light gray suit across the aisle leaned toward her cautiously. "Excuse me," he said, his voice unsure. "I saw what happened earlier. I just wanted to say, that was wrong. You handled it better than most would have." Evelyn gave a small nod. "Thank you." He hesitated before asking, "Do things like that happen a lot?" Her eyes met his. "More than you'd believe." He sat back, unsure of how to respond. Evelyn returned her gaze to the window. Outside, the clouds floated peacefully by, but inside the cabin, things were shifting. The silence had weight now. People were aware. And once awareness settles in, it doesn't leave easily. She didn't need validation from strangers, but something had cracked. The surface of indifference that had covered the cabin when she was first denied water was now gone. And what took its place was discomfort. Not hers. Theirs. Her phone buzzed quietly in the armrest compartment. Thomas. "Mid-flight update. Board has been notified. Policy review will begin this week. Keep calm." She won't touch another passenger again without thinking twice. Evelyn locked the screen and folded her hands again. The consequences weren't over. They were only just beginning. The flight moved on as if nothing had happened, but the tension didn't fade. It hovered in the air, unspoken, sitting just beneath the quiet conversations and the soft clinking of drink glasses. Passengers still pretended to be immersed in their books or screens, but the truth was evident in the glances. Short, careful looks toward seat 2B, where Evelyn sat composed, unreadable. Marla stayed in the galley longer than usual, pretending to organize supplies that didn't need organizing. Her hands moved, but her mind was elsewhere. She had worked on planes for over 12 years. She had dealt with angry passengers, drunk ones, rude ones, even abusive ones, but none of them had ever made her feel this small. Evelyn hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't made a scene. And somehow, that made everything worse. The quietness, the dignity. It left no space for Marla to defend herself. She wasn't being yelled at or insulted. She was being watched, measured, and exposed by her own behavior. Julia broke the silence between them. "You didn't think this one through." Marla's eyes snapped toward her. "Excuse me?" "I mean," Julia said carefully, "you've been strict before. But this time, it's different. You didn't know who she was." Marla folded her arms. "That's not the point. I don't care about titles. But you do care about appearances," Julia said, her voice soft but pointed. "You saw her and you decided something, before she even opened her mouth." Marla's jaw clenched. "I followed the process." "No," Julia replied, looking directly at her now. "You followed your instinct, and your instinct was wrong." There was no argument left to make. Marla turned away and pretended to check the temperature on the oven trays. At the front of the plane, the captain received another message through the secure channel. It was short but clear. "Mr. Langston will meet Flight 747 at the gate. Prepare priority disembark for 2B. Have senior ground security present." The captain glanced at the flight manifest. "Row 2B, Judge Evelyn Rhodes." He let out a slow breath. This was no longer an internal crew issue. This was escalating, and fast. Evelyn, still unaware of the exact plans being made, continued reading. Her posture was unchanged. Her face didn't reveal any emotion. But inside, she was watching how passengers were reacting, how silence had turned into glances, and how the weight of guilt moved from her shoulders to the people around her. A man 3 rows back whispered something to his wife. Another woman, older and dressed in expensive jewelry, kept looking forward, then down, her expression stiff. These were people who said nothing when it happened, who chose comfort over conscience. Now they were the ones feeling out of place. Evelyn didn't need to make them feel that way. She just had to exist. And that, she knew, was what made it all the more uncomfortable for them. The seatbelt sign blinked on again as the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are stowed. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Evelyn calmly closed her folder, secured it inside her bag, and adjusted her glasses. Outside the window, the city came into view. Inside the plane, a reckoning was still quietly building. As the plane descended slowly toward the runway, the silence inside the cabin thickened. The usual energy that filled first class during landing, people stretching, chatting, preparing to leave, wasn't there. Passengers sat upright, but stiff. Many stole glances at Evelyn when they thought she wouldn't notice. A few didn't even bother hiding it. The man in one seat tapped his fingers nervously against the armrest. The couple across the aisle whispered in hushed tones, their eyes flicking between Evelyn and the galley. Evelyn remained still. Her hands rested gently on her lap, her expression unreadable. The weight of what had happened earlier didn't show on her face, but it was there in the room, hanging over every glance, every unfinished thought. Marla hadn't returned to first class since the apology. She stayed tucked in the galley, hands moving, mind racing. She wanted the flight to be over. She had never dreaded a landing before, but now the moment couldn't come fast enough. She had already received a second call from the cockpit. Thomas Langston was meeting the flight at the gate. No assistant, no representative, him. That alone told her this wasn't going to be a quick lecture behind closed doors. This was going to be official, serious, maybe even public. Julia leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You okay?" Marla didn't respond. "Do you know what you're going to say?" Still nothing. Julia sighed. "You could have just brought her a bottle of water." "I didn't think—" Marla started, then stopped. Because that was the problem. She had thought, she had made a choice, and the truth of it was now impossible to outrun. At the front of the plane, the captain tapped in the final codes for landing clearance. He glanced once more at the message on his screen, then at the list of senior executives scheduled to meet the aircraft. He had flown this airline for 19 years, and had never seen the CEO request to personally greet a flight. It didn't take long to understand why. Evelyn's phone buzzed gently in her seat pocket. She slid it out and checked the message. "Thomas Langston, we're parked at gate 18. I'll be there when the doors open. You'll be the first to exit. There will be press outside. Just so you know." Her lips pressed together. She didn't need attention. She didn't need headlines. But if attention was what it took to make people like Marla think twice next time, they could have all the cameras they wanted. The plane touched down with a soft bump, the wheels rumbling beneath the cabin. No one clapped. No one cheered. The only sound was the soft thud of landing gear and the creak of the brakes. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The local time is 4:26 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with us." Evelyn reached down, unbuckled her belt, and adjusted her blazer. The woman who had been treated like an inconvenience a few hours ago was now the center of the entire plane's silent attention. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Immediately, 2 uniformed crew members stepped through the cabin door and stood to the side, clearing the aisle. Julia approached from the galley, whispering nervously, "They're asking for 2B to deplane first." Marla stood back, arms stiff at her sides. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't speak. Evelyn rose from her seat, placed her bag on her shoulder and walked forward, calm, unhurried, and perfectly composed. She didn't glance at the passengers. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. The guilt in their eyes said even more. When she reached the cabin door, the gate outside was swarming. A private black sedan idled nearby. Airport security officers stood neatly in place, and at the center of it all stood Thomas Langston, tall, composed, and visibly waiting for only one person. He stepped forward as Evelyn exited the plane, nodding once. "Welcome home." And just like that, she was gone. Behind her, inside the plane, the cabin sat frozen, because now everyone knew. This flight would not be forgotten. The second Evelyn stepped off the plane, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The jet bridge, usually a blur of airport staff and rolling carts, had fallen still. The security team flanked both sides of the narrow walkway, their postures formal but alert. And just ahead stood Thomas Langston, CEO of the airline, dressed in a charcoal suit, hands folded, his face calm but unreadable. Evelyn didn't pause. She walked toward him with the same steady grace that had unsettled half the cabin for the past few hours. Thomas took a step forward and offered his hand. "Thank you for your patience," he said. Evelyn shook his hand, nodding once. "Thank you for taking it seriously." He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew. Every word, every complaint, every second had been documented and reviewed mid-flight. The system had worked exactly how it was designed to. Swift escalation, internal notification, real-time response. But what had happened to Evelyn wasn't a system error. It was a personal failure, and Thomas knew it. He guided her toward a private lounge beside the gate. Inside, a press team stood waiting, not to speak to Evelyn, but to document what came next. Public accountability. No more quiet apologies hidden behind closed doors. That was one of the new principles Thomas had implemented after similar incidents in the past. Too many wrongs had been swept under the rug. Not this time. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the tension had evolved from silence to full discomfort. Passengers whispered now, no longer trying to hide it. They glanced around at one another, exchanging brief looks that said, "Did you know who she was? Did you see how they escorted her?" And worse, "Why didn't we say something?" In the galley, Marla was still frozen. She hadn't moved since the doors opened. Her face was pale, her fingers clenched around the edge of the counter. She had spent most of her career believing she was untouchable. Even when passengers complained before, it never went this far. A written warning, maybe. A quiet conversation with her manager, but now she was waiting to be called off the plane by someone with a badge and a clipboard. And it didn't take long. "Ms. Jennings?" The voice was male, professional, and close. She turned her head slowly to see a man in an airport operations uniform standing in the aisle, accompanied by 2 senior managers and a security officer. His tone was neutral, but there was no mistaking what was happening. "We'll need you to step off the aircraft. Mr. Langston has requested a formal debrief." The passengers closest to the front stiffened. Some leaned slightly forward in their seats. A few pulled out phones, pretending to scroll while recording in silence. Marla swallowed hard. She adjusted her uniform mechanically, then walked down the aisle with stiff legs, her heels clicking louder than they ever had before. She passed Julia, who stood just behind the curtain, her arms crossed. Not smug at all, but watching. Watching the shift that had come not from rage or drama, but from stillness. From someone who said nothing and let the system reveal the truth. Marla stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge. She expected a closed room, a quiet talk, maybe some paperwork. Instead, she walked straight into the lounge and straight into Thomas Langston. Her steps faltered just for a moment, but everyone saw it. He didn't stand, he didn't smile. "Ms. Jennings," he said, voice cold but steady. "Take a seat." She obeyed, her hands folding tightly in her lap. Evelyn sat beside him, silent, poised. Thomas reached into a folder and pulled out the flight report. He didn't speak for a long moment. The cameras remained fixed, still recording. When he finally looked up, his words were measured. "You denied a basic courtesy. Then you escalated a simple request into public humiliation. And then, after being told who you were dealing with, you delivered an apology that failed to even acknowledge what you had done wrong." Marla opened her mouth, but Thomas lifted one finger. "Don't interrupt." He turned toward Evelyn. "Judge Rhodes, if you're willing, I'd like to offer her the opportunity to listen. Not defend, just listen." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She looked Marla in the eye. "I asked for water. You saw me, and you decided I didn't belong. That was your choice. I've spent my career writing laws to protect people from decisions like yours. But no law can change the way people think. Only consequences can do that." Marla's face tightened, but she didn't speak. Evelyn continued, her voice low. "You didn't just disrespect me. You taught every passenger who saw it that some people deserve less. That's not something you fix with a weak apology. That's something you answer for." Thomas nodded. "You'll be placed on immediate suspension, pending board review. Until then, you are relieved of duty." Marla's eyes filled, but no tears fell. She stood slowly, her shoulders tight, and walked out of the room. This time, not just embarrassed, but changed. In the silence that followed, Thomas turned back to Evelyn. "Would you like us to release a statement?" She shook her head. "Let the silence speak. They'll remember more that way." And she was right, because everyone who saw it, on the plane, in the terminal, and eventually online, would remember it not as a scandal, but as a reckoning. One that didn't need shouting to make history. News of what had happened aboard Flight 747 didn't take long to reach beyond the airport. Within hours of landing, social media posts began to surface. A blurry photo showed Evelyn walking off the jet bridge with Thomas Langston beside her. Another showed Marla, escorted out minutes later, face pale and shoulders tight. No captions were needed. The images spoke for themselves. But that didn't stop the internet from speaking anyway. Comments poured in under hashtags like #Judge Rhodes, #Airline Justice, and #First Class Bias. Some users expressed outrage. Others shared personal stories of similar experiences. Stories of quiet discrimination brushed off as misunderstandings. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. And people knew it. Inside the corporate headquarters of the airline, Thomas Langston sat with his executive team in the early hours of the evening. A board meeting had been called ahead of schedule. The incident wasn't just embarrassing, it was a reflection of something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Thomas stood at the front of the glass-walled conference room, his face calm but sharp. "This isn't a PR issue," he told them. "It's a value issue. Our policy says first class is first class. No questions asked, no judgments made. But policies mean nothing when they're ignored by the people meant to carry them out." An executive raised a hand. "Should we issue a public apology?" Thomas shook his head. "Not yet. We wait. Not because we're hiding, because this isn't about saving face. It's about making real changes." He tapped the stack of printed incident reports on the table. "We've suspended 5 employees in the last 2 years for similar behavior. Private complaints, internal actions, no public accountability. That ends now." Across town, Evelyn sat in her apartment overlooking the city skyline. The lights of the buildings blinked gently against the glass as she sipped her tea. She wasn't interested in the headlines. She didn't turn on the news. She didn't check the hashtags. She didn't need validation. What mattered to her was that someone had been forced to see the consequences of their choices, and more importantly, that systems were moving. Her assistant Lee called just past 7:30 p.m. "You're trending," she said. "Everyone's talking about it. They want to know if you're going to give a statement." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Let them talk." Lee hesitated. "Do you want me to draft something? A note, maybe? Just to clarify?" "No," Evelyn replied. "Not yet. Let the silence sit with them. Let them feel it." Across the city, Marla sat alone in her small apartment. Her uniform jacket hung on the back of a chair, and her phone buzzed constantly with messages from coworkers, friends, even family. Some offered support, others were less kind. She didn't answer any of them. Her mind kept replaying Evelyn's words. "You didn't just disrespect me. You taught every passenger who saw it that some people deserve less." It hadn't been said with anger. It had been said with weight. And the more she thought about it, the heavier it felt. She had spent years following rules, convincing herself that professionalism was enough. But now she saw it. Rules meant nothing without judgment, and hers had been wrong. Her inbox had already been updated with a notification from HR. Mandatory meeting with the disciplinary review board. Response required within 48 hours. She stared at it, her hands still. Not because she was surprised, but because she finally understood what she had done. Back at headquarters, Thomas Langston's team had begun drafting a new training protocol, one that wouldn't just include customer service skills and policy memorization, but one that forced employees to face what they carried into the cabin: their assumptions. He looked out the tall office window toward the airport in the distance. "This wasn't just a wake-up call," he said to his chief of staff. "This was the consequence we've been avoiding." "And what about Judge Rhodes?" the chief asked. Thomas folded his arms. "She doesn't want praise, but she deserves progress." And Evelyn, hundreds of feet above the city, silent in her home, knew change had already begun. Not through noise, but through the power of being seen, and not looking away. The following morning, the city woke up to headlines. Judge removed from first class over water request. Airline CEO responds in person. Passenger silence called out after flight incident. It wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. Quiet dignity, loud consequences. How one judge changed airline policy overnight. Every major outlet had picked it up. News anchors ran with it, debating the implications of Evelyn's experience. Racial bias, authority misuse, the passive role of bystanders. Editorials began surfacing, many echoing one uncomfortable truth. The silence of the passengers had enabled the humiliation. It wasn't just Marla under scrutiny now, it was everyone who had watched it happen. Inside her apartment, Evelyn sat on the edge of her couch, the television playing softly in the background. She wasn't watching it. Her focus was on the folded letter in her hands. It had arrived early that morning, hand-delivered in a cream envelope bearing the airline seal. It was from Thomas. The letter was short. Director, Judge Rhodes, thank you for your grace. The board has unanimously voted to launch a full investigation into all first-class service complaints over the last 24 months. I will also be leading a new division focused on internal accountability. You've triggered a much-needed change, one I should have initiated long ago. If there's anything else I can do, privately or publicly, consider this an open line. TL. Evelyn read it twice before setting it down. She appreciated the gesture, but she wasn't looking for personal attention. She wasn't trying to be a symbol. All she had ever wanted was fairness, to be treated like anyone else, without suspicion or skepticism. Without needing to prove she belonged where she already was. Her assistant Lee called again just after 10 a.m. There's a school in Atlanta, Lee said without preamble. They want to use your speech as a case study, not the incident, the response. Evelyn blinked. My speech? Yes. The keynote on courtroom bias. They said your response on the plane reflects the exact principles you outlined. Calm confrontation, speaking only when it matters. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. Funny how life doesn't wait for a podium. Lee laughed softly. Also, a dozen invitations came in this morning. Panel talks, law symposiums, even a university ethics forum. I didn't do anything dramatic, Evelyn replied. Exactly, Lee said. That's why it worked. Across the city, in a nondescript conference room near the airport, Marla sat waiting for her disciplinary hearing to begin. Her hands were clasped tightly on the table, her eyes focused on the untouched glass of water in front of her. This time, no one had denied her a drink. This time, the discomfort wasn't in the request. It was in the weight of what she hadn't done. 3 senior board members entered, along with a representative from HR and a legal advisor. No one smiled. No one made small talk. It was a review, not a trial, but the air felt just as heavy. They asked her to recount the incident, every detail. She spoke slowly, honestly, for the first time without excuses. She admitted she hadn't recognized Evelyn. She admitted she had assumed something based on nothing but image and instinct. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She didn't try to spin it. When she finished, the room was silent. One of the board members, an older man with white hair and a sharp voice, leaned forward. Do you understand why this isn't just about you? Marla nodded. Because if someone like her can be treated like that, then someone without a title wouldn't even have a chance. Another board member scribbled a note. You've been here a long time, Ms. Jennings. Long enough to know better. I do, she said quietly. Now I do. The board didn't give a decision that day. They dismissed her with a standard line. We'll notify you within 5 business days. But Marla knew her career was no longer in her hands. Whatever came next, termination, reassignment, public apology, it was out of her control now. She stepped outside, squinting into the morning sun. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not indignation, remorse. And back in her office, Evelyn placed the envelope from Thomas in her drawer, next to old court transcripts and quiet victories. This wasn't a victory she had planned. It wasn't a speech, it wasn't a ruling. But it mattered, and that, she knew, would ripple further than anything she could ever write. 2 days later, Evelyn walked through the revolving glass doors of the downtown legal center, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. She had been invited to speak, not as a judge, not as a keynote speaker, but as someone who had lived through something raw, recent, and real. The legal community was eager to hear her perspective, not because of her resume, but because of how she had handled what everyone now called The Flight 747 incident. The auditorium wasn't massive, but it was packed. Law students, attorneys, retired judges, ethics professors, even a few airline industry reps filled the rows. The topic listed on the program simply read, "Accountability in moments that don't look like history." When Evelyn stepped up to the podium, there was no applause, only quiet. The kind of silence that holds weight. The kind that comes before people hear something they know will sit with them. She didn't open with greetings. She didn't waste time on formalities. "When I asked for water on that flight," she began, her voice steady, "I didn't expect a problem. I wasn't looking to challenge anyone. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was thirsty." Some in the room nodded slowly. Others sat frozen. But the response I received told me something I've known my whole life. It told me that even in a space I paid to be in, even with all my credentials, even dressed in a suit and holding a federal ID, I could still be doubted, still be dismissed. Her eyes swept the room. No one looked away. "And the worst part?" she asked. It wasn't that she said no. It was how she said it, as if I didn't deserve the decency of a reason, as if I was being difficult just for asking. A murmur of agreement passed through the audience. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't report her mid-flight. I sent a message to someone who listens, not because of his position, but because he understands power doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Evelyn paused, letting the silence do its work. By the time we landed, the damage was done. Not to me. I'm used to being underestimated. The damage was to the passengers who said nothing, the ones who watched it happen and chose comfort over conscience. That's what stays with me. She leaned slightly forward. This isn't just about flights or uniforms or boarding passes. It's about how quickly we choose silence when something isn't happening to us. A soft rustle spread through the room. Notes being taken, heads nodding, throats clearing. Eyes were fixed on her. "I didn't make history on that flight," she said, "but I watched it repeat itself again and again and again. What changed this time was that someone was watching who had the power to make people listen." She closed her binder and stepped away from the podium. There was no applause at first. And then, like a slow wave, the room stood, one row at a time, not for drama, but for understanding. Later that evening, in a quiet corner of the conference center, Evelyn was approached by a young woman no older than 23. Her voice shook slightly. "My mom's a flight attendant," she said. "She's always said the job isn't just about rules, it's about judgment. She called me after she saw what happened to you. She said it made her think about how she talks to people. She told me she was embarrassed." Evelyn listened without interrupting. "She's been working for 18 years, and she's never talked like that before," the woman added. "So, thank you, I guess. Not just for speaking up, but for not letting it slide." Evelyn gave her a gentle nod. The moment matters more when you let it change someone who's never been asked to change before. Across town, in an empty break room at airline headquarters, Marla sat alone. Her final disciplinary verdict had come in hours earlier. Termination, with cause, no rehire eligibility. It had been expected. Still, she had stared at the letter for a long time. She had cleared out her locker. She had turned in her ID badge. But before leaving, she asked one thing of HR: permission to write a letter. Not to management, not to her union, to Evelyn. She sat there now, pen in hand, struggling with the first sentence. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because this was the first time in years she was saying it with no control, no excuse, no way back. After several failed starts, she finally began. "I failed you. And not because of a mistake, but because of a mindset I never questioned. You didn't need me to serve you water. You needed me to see you. And I didn't. I've lost my job, yes. But what hurts more is that I lost my understanding of who I thought I was. And now, I begin again. I just hope that matters, even if it's too late to matter to you." She folded the paper carefully and placed it in the addressed envelope. For the first time in days, she felt something closer to honest than shame. And Evelyn, hundreds of miles away, stood in her hotel window watching the city light up below. She didn't know about the letter yet, but something told her. This story wasn't over. It had only just reached the part where change begins. The next morning, the letter arrived at Evelyn's residence, tucked neatly between a stack of forwarded mail. Her assistant Lee had picked up the bundle from the courthouse drop and placed it on Evelyn's desk without comment, not noticing the small handwritten envelope addressed with care. It wasn't marked with a return address, just her name and title in clean cursive across the front. For Judge Evelyn Rhodes. Evelyn returned from her morning walk a little after 9 a.m., still in her walking shoes and coat. The quiet of her apartment welcomed her like always, sunlight cutting across the hardwood floors and warming the edge of her reading chair. She set her keys down, poured herself a glass of water, and began sorting through the papers. Invitations, reports, a magazine clipping, and then the envelope. She almost set it aside. So many notes had come in lately, some from strangers, others from colleagues, most of them offering solidarity or asking for guidance. But something about this one felt different. The weight of it, the restraint of the handwriting, the fact that it didn't come with a typed letterhead or a business card. She opened it slowly. As she read the first few lines, her breath caught. Not from anger, not from pain, from something else. Recognition. It was Marla. Evelyn sat down, the page in her lap, and read the letter word by word. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't performative. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It was real. Raw in a way most people avoided. There was a line halfway through that made Evelyn's hand still for several seconds. You needed me to see you, and I didn't. She exhaled slowly and read the line again. She'd spent years hearing half-hearted apologies from the stand, carefully crafted statements meant to reduce punishment or win back favor. But this wasn't that. This wasn't about saving face. This was about facing something unfiltered and ugly, and not looking away. She didn't respond to the letter that day. Instead, she carried it into her study and placed it inside a slim folder marked Personal Correspondence, a file she rarely added to. Inside were only 3 other letters. One from her father the day she passed the bar, one from a woman whose wrongful eviction case she'd overturned, and one from a high school teacher who had said Evelyn was too quiet to lead. Marla's letter sat among them now, not because Evelyn forgave her, but because it mattered. Later that afternoon, Evelyn found herself at the university where she had been invited to speak to law students, not about her rulings or her legal philosophy, but about moral courage. It was an open forum, and the auditorium was filled with more than just students. Professors, activists, journalists, even a few airline employees sat in silence as she approached the center of the stage. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. I've been thinking about apologies, she began, hands at her sides. Not the ones that come easy. The ones that come after everything is already broken. The room was silent. We live in a time where everyone's afraid of being wrong. So we rehearse our words. We plan our exits. We find new ways to defend the same old behavior. But what we don't do, often enough, is sit in the discomfort of being the problem. She let that settle. I received a letter this morning from someone who failed me. Publicly. Completely. But she didn't write to justify. She wrote to admit. She wrote to sit in what she did without asking me to carry any part of it for her. A few heads turned. Some already knew what she was referring to. I'm not telling you this to invite sympathy. I'm telling you this because it's rare, and it shouldn't be. She paused and looked out over the room. If you want to work in law or policy or any space where power shifts hands every day, understand this. Your mistakes won't define you as much as your reaction to them will. After the talk, dozens of students approached her, each with questions. Some about the law, others about how to speak up when no one else will. But one student, a young man in a maintenance uniform, quiet and respectful, waited until the very end to step forward. I was on a flight once, he said almost in a whisper. They skipped me during service. I raised my hand twice. They never came. I didn't say anything. I figured it wasn't worth it. Evelyn looked at him. But you remember it. He nodded. I didn't matter enough to be seen. Her voice was soft. You always did. They just didn't know how to look. He swallowed hard, nodded once, and walked away. That night, Evelyn sat by her window again, the city lights flickering like stars turned upside down. The story of Flight 747 wasn't in the headlines anymore. The cameras had moved on. The news cycle had shifted, but the change hadn't stopped. It was moving through quieter places now. Offices, classrooms, coffee shop conversations, late-night texts between friends who said nothing when it mattered most. And in one small apartment across town, a woman named Marla sat at her kitchen table, jobless but not hopeless, writing her second letter. Not to Evelyn, to herself. She titled it simply, What I Used to Believe. And with every word, she rewrote the version of herself she never thought she'd have to face. Change had begun, not loudly, but undeniably. Days turned into weeks and the headlines slowly faded into the background. Flight 747 was no longer trending. Hashtags quieted. News alerts moved on to louder stories, new controversies, fresh scandals. But the true impact of what happened never depended on trending moments. It lived in quieter spaces, and those spaces had started to shift. At the airline headquarters, a new department had quietly been formed under Thomas Langston's direction, passenger equity and conduct oversight. It was the first of its kind for any commercial airline. Staffed with investigators, behavioral analysts, and a small team of external ethics consultants, their purpose wasn't just to respond to complaints. Their role was to identify patterns, silent ones, the kind that never made it to formal reports but showed up in data, in tone, in how often certain passengers were questioned versus others. Thomas made it clear, we're not building this department to protect the company. We're building it to confront the culture. And internally, that culture was changing. Slowly, uneasily, but it was. Flight attendants were now required to complete scenario-based ethics evaluations every quarter, not modules, not tick-box trainings. Real, uncomfortable situations reviewed anonymously and discussed in live workshops. Uniformed staff were paired with passengers of varying backgrounds in rotating shadowing programs. Evaluation forms were rewritten with a new section. Did you feel seen? Did you feel equal? Did you feel dismissed? And every comment had to be read by someone with the power to change something. None of this was advertised. Thomas had insisted on that. If we're doing it for the press, he told his board, then we're not doing it for the right reasons. Back in the courthouse, Evelyn had returned to her regular caseload. Civil disputes, small claims, property disagreements. She moved through her docket with the same clarity and fairness that had earned her the robe in the first place. Yet something in her had shifted. Not louder, not harder, just sharper. She looked at every plaintiff and defendant a little longer now, not to question them but to make sure she was seeing them. Completely. And that mattered. In courtrooms, little moments build trust, and trust, she believed, was the first thing that disappeared when bias entered the room. It was a late Thursday when she received an unexpected visitor. She had just finished her final hearing and was gathering her files when her assistant poked her head in. There's someone asking to see you. She didn't make an appointment. Evelyn looked up. Who? The assistant hesitated. She said, her name is Marla. Evelyn stilled for a moment, then nodded. Send her in. Marla entered dressed plainly, jeans, a soft gray sweater, and no makeup. Her posture was different. Not defeated, not defensive. Just honest. Judge Rhodes, she said softly. Evelyn gestured to the chair across from her. Please. Marla sat. Her hands were folded in her lap. I don't want to take much of your time, she began. And I didn't come here expecting anything. I just needed to say something, face to face. Evelyn waited, listening. I've been in therapy since the hearing, Marla continued. I've been unpacking how I see people, how I talk to them, how I decide who deserves what." Evelyn said nothing. That silence, as always, made the words hit harder. "I've realized I was proud of being firm. I thought it made me strong, but it made me careless. I never wanted to admit that. I thought professionalism meant keeping people at a distance, but now I think it means the opposite." Evelyn finally spoke. "You've done a lot of work." Marla nodded, eyes misting but steady. "I'm not looking for forgiveness. I don't expect it. I just needed you to know that I don't walk through airports the same way anymore. I don't see passengers the same way, and I won't ever work in that role again. But whatever I do next, I'll remember that moment." She swallowed. "I just wanted you to see me, the way I didn't see you." Evelyn's voice was soft but firm. "I do see you, and I hope moving forward, you see others just as clearly." Marla gave a slow nod. "Thank you. That's all I needed." She stood, hesitated for a moment, then quietly left the office. Evelyn remained still for several moments after, her fingers resting lightly on the folder before her. That moment, quiet, raw, human, was more meaningful than any viral clip, more powerful than any policy. It was proof that change wasn't always a wave crashing through the system. Sometimes it was a whisper, carried by someone who finally chose to listen. That night, as Evelyn prepared her notes for an upcoming legal panel, she paused and wrote a single line at the top of the page. "The most important laws are the ones we enforce inside ourselves." And with that, she closed her notebook, turned off the light, and let the quiet settle, strong, steady, and earned. 3 months had passed since Flight 747 landed, but its impact continued to unfold, quietly, consistently, and in places where cameras couldn't reach. At an airline training facility outside the city, a group of new flight attendants gathered in a sleek, modern classroom. Posters on the wall showed smiling crews, emergency exit procedures, and diagrams of aircraft seating layouts. But there was one display that stood apart. It was a simple black poster with white text at the top. "People don't remember what you served. They remember how you made them feel." Beneath it, a training module had been added, now part of the standard onboarding process. Case study, Flight 747. The facilitator, a former flight manager named Carla Weaver, stood at the front of the room. She clicked the screen and brought up a slideshow. The first slide didn't show a face, just a name: Judge Evelyn Rhodes. "Some of you may have heard about this case," she said. "It wasn't a headline for long. But inside this company, it marked a permanent shift." The room grew still. Carla explained the incident, not dramatically, not emotionally, but factually. She described how a simple request for water became a turning point. She highlighted the silence of the other passengers, the delay in service, the tone used, the assumptions made. She described how the judge reacted, with calm, dignity, and restraint. Then she paused on a slide showing a quote. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice." "This," Carla said, "is what bias looks like when you don't recognize it. And this." She clicked to the next slide, showing the image of Marla's resignation letter. "Is what accountability looks like when it finally arrives." A young man raised his hand. "Did the judge ever respond publicly?" "She didn't need to," Carla replied. "Her silence did more than a press conference ever could." Back in the city, Evelyn sat inside a different kind of room. Not a courtroom, not a classroom. A small community center with mismatched chairs and a loose circle of folding tables. A local outreach program had invited her to speak to a group of formerly incarcerated women now in a re-entry program. Women who had faced systems that rarely saw them fully, if at all. She didn't sit at the head of the table. She chose a chair among them. "I wasn't removed from first class because of my job," she said, her voice steady. "I was removed because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged." The women listened, not out of obligation, but because they understood. Not from news, from experience. "You've probably felt that," Evelyn continued. "Maybe not on a plane. Maybe in a bank, a hospital, a classroom. Maybe you've heard the tone, the dismissal, the doubt. Heads nodded. "I didn't fight back on that flight with volume," she said. "I fought with presence, and that was enough." One woman, no older than 30, with a soft voice and tired eyes, leaned forward. "But what if you don't have a title? What if they don't care who you are?" Evelyn looked at her. "Then your presence is still your power. You don't need a robe or a microphone, you just need to know your worth. If you know it, you carry it. And when you carry it long enough, people start to feel it, even if they pretend not to." The room fell quiet again. Meanwhile, inside a quiet office at the airline's HR department, Marla sat across from a new employee, a young Latina woman named Anna, just 3 weeks into her job. Marla wasn't there to discipline. She wasn't there to manage. She had come back, not as crew, but as a guest speaker in the new ethics mentorship rotation. It was part of the agreement she had made during her exit interview, that if she wanted to stay connected to the company in any capacity, it would only be to teach what not to do. She looked different now, less polished, less scripted, but more real. "I used to think I was fair," she told Anna, who was scribbling notes. "But fairness doesn't mean equal treatment. It means equal thought. It means checking yourself before you act. It means asking why you're about to say what you're about to say." Anna looked up. "Do you think she'll ever forgive you?" Marla smiled faintly. "She doesn't need to. She gave me something more useful. She made me see myself, clearly for the first time." At that same hour, Evelyn was finishing her final case for the day. A landlord-tenant dispute, small claims, nothing glamorous. But as she signed the ruling, she thought about all the rooms she'd sat in lately. The courthouse, the community center, the university, the plane. All so different, yet all linked by the same thread: how people are seen, and how quickly they are not. She gathered her robe, turned off the light, and stepped outside into the dusky evening. She didn't need to tell the world what happened to her. The world had already been told, and the echo of that moment, wordless, powerful, undeniable, was still traveling, one conversation at a time, one decision at a time. And Evelyn Rhodes, she would keep showing up, not to be heard, but to make sure someone else was finally seen. 6 months had passed since Flight 747. The pace of life had resumed, just as it always did. News cycles had shifted. People had moved on. For most, the incident had become just another story, an example of modern injustice that sparked a reaction, then slowly faded. But for those who had truly paid attention, for those who felt the silence of that moment sit heavy in their chest, the memory remained. Not loud, but alive. Evelyn sat alone in the gallery of a quiet courthouse, long after the last case had been dismissed. It was a place she rarely lingered in without reason. But today wasn't about hearings or motions or rulings. Today marked her 25th year as a judge. No ceremonies had been planned, no speeches. That was her request. Instead, she had asked for the courtroom to remain open after hours. Empty. Still. She wanted to sit where so many had sat before her. People seeking justice, people fearing judgment, people simply wanting to be believed. She looked out across the room, rows of benches bathed in golden evening light, and she thought about all the times she had stood in front of systems that didn't expect her to belong. She wasn't supposed to make it this far. Not as a woman, not as a black woman, not as someone who refused to play the part others had written for her. But she had, and she had done so without ever raising her voice to be heard. The door creaked behind her. She turned. It was Lee, her assistant, holding a small box wrapped in gray paper. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "I told you no gifts." Lee grinned. "It's not a gift. It's acknowledgement." Evelyn took the box, unwrapped it carefully, and lifted the lid. Inside was a framed photo, low quality, clearly taken from a phone. But it was unmistakable. The shot captured her on the jet bridge of Flight 747, walking away from the plane with Thomas Langston just behind her, a row of security and airline staff in the background. She hadn't seen this angle before. She hadn't known it existed. But what struck her wasn't her own face in the photo. It was the look of every person around her. The flight crew, nervous. The officers, stoic. Thomas, resolute. And Evelyn, calm, unapologetically, completely herself. Beneath the photo was a small plaque with a quote etched into the metal. "The silence you held taught more than words ever could." For a long moment, Evelyn didn't say anything. She ran her thumb along the edge of the frame, her expression unreadable, as always. Then she set the photo down gently on the bench beside her. "I didn't ask for that moment," she said softly. "I know," Lee replied. "But you answered it." Outside the courthouse, the streets were alive with people who had never heard of Evelyn Rhodes, who had never read about a flight where a woman had to ask twice for a bottle of water, who didn't know about a letter that had changed a career, or about a judge who never raised her voice, but changed policy, hearts, and habits just by refusing to be invisible. And yet the changes were there. In quiet apologies delivered faster, in fewer assumptions, in second glances that led to second thoughts, in the stories told during airline training sessions, in classrooms, in family dinners, in whispered conversations between strangers who said, "Remember that judge?" Evelyn stood slowly, still holding the frame, and looked once more across the empty room. She didn't smile. That wasn't her way. But she did feel something deeper. Stillness, not the kind that hides, the kind that stands, the kind that waits, the kind that reminds the world, "I am here, I am watching, I am not afraid to be seen." And with that, she stepped out of the courtroom into the evening breeze and walked forward, not into a spotlight, but into her life, unchanged in who she was, unshakable in what she stood for, and unforgettable in what her silence had done. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories.